Let's sew up some June bug boxer shorts. I'm using this denim. It has a really nice right side, which is this floral, and wrong side. So you should be able to tell the difference really easily in the video. I'm sewing up a youth size. I did back pockets, which I have pre-hemmed that very first, or pre-pressed that top. 1-inch elastic for the youth. I use knit elastic. These are the leg cuffs. I again pre-pressed them. I like to press all my pieces before I even start sewing. Here is my faux fly. I'm doing a closed one. And then this is the waistband. I have pre-pressed it and pressed a little bit of interfacing because I will be doing the drawstring option, which this is the drawstring. Again, I pre-pressed it. We're going to sew it like binding. So I've pressed all the edges in and then along that center crease to enclose all of the edges. I'll go over that again later when we're on that step. We're going to start with the pockets, which I'm doing back pockets on this one. Again, I have pre-pressed the 1 inch to the wrong side. I'm just going to hem along the raw folded up edge. I'm sewing from the top of the fabric. You can flip this over and sew from the wrong side, whatever you are more comfortable with and like the look of better. I also leave the edge raw and then sew 2 stitch lines to finish that edge. If you just want to sew 1 stitch line, make sure you finish your edge if your fabric is a woven and is going to fray. If you want to sew 2, like me, that should finish the edge nicely. Unless you're sewing something that is a very loosely woven fabric, something that frays really easily, like a linen or a flannel, I might go ahead and finish the edge and do 2 stitch lines just to make sure. I'm always extra cautious with those kind of fabrics. Do not want anything fraying on me when I take the time to make something. I have taken my back pocket pieces to my iron and pressed all the remaining edges, the sides and the bottom, 1/2 inch to the wrong side. Now we're going to use the pocket marking on the pattern piece and pin our pocket to our back pieces. Make sure if your fabric doesn't have a really obvious right and wrong side that you are creating 2 mirror images. You'll want a back left leg and a back right leg, so make sure you're not creating 2 pieces that are exactly the same. Once we've got our pocket pinned on, we're just going to top stitch them on. Again, I like to use 2 rows of stitches. If you are someone that you actually uses your back pockets, or the little one you're making them for uses the back pockets, I do recommend using some kind of reinforcing stitches at the top 2 corners. I am just going to do 2 stitches around the entire thing. I like the way it looks. It's nice and quick and easy. Other options that you can do are just double stitching right at the top. You can also stitch a little triangle at that corner. You can also use a little bar tack at the corner. If your little one or you use your back pockets so much that double stitching is not strong enough to hold on your pockets normally, something else you can do to add a little bit of more oomph or strength to that little section is iron on a little circle or square, about 1 inch by inch, on the wrong side of your main back piece, right where those back pocket corners are. And that'll just help, again, reinforce that fabric so that hopefully nothing pulls out or unravels or gets too weakened from use. So far, we've been just fine with just a little bit of reinforced stitching on our corners, so that's all I'm going to do. I didn't do any interfacing on these. And I have a bit of a contrast thread here. I think that helps with the videos, being able to see the thread a little bit. You can add a contrast thread or match your fabric as best you can, whatever you like the look of. Just trimming my very beginning threads and ending threads. There we go, and we're just going to repeat on the other side, again making sure you're creating two mirror image pieces. Alright, up next we're going to be doing inseam pockets. I'm using this little plain cotton fabric. Again, it should be nice and easy to tell apart from my main fabrics. I have my front pieces here, and I have my marking from the pattern piece. If you're doing a youth, there is a little marking where you can align the inseam pockets, the top of the inseam pocket to that marking. If you're doing the adult, it has a measurement in the tutorial. I believe it's 2 inches from the top if you're doing high rise, and just 1/2 inch from the top if you're doing mid rise. This will vary a little bit personally where you want your pockets. If you have shorter arms or longer arms, or you're adding to your rise, you're taking away from your rise from your height, you might want to just kind of hold it up to yourself and make sure they're where you want. This is a good estimate, especially if you're average height with average arm length. We're just pinning right sides together to our fronts, and now I'm going to repeat the same thing on the back. Even though they all have a marking, I highly prefer to line mine up like this, just to double check and make sure that I got all my markings exactly the same, so that my pockets are going to line up perfectly for me. So I just like to set them side by side as I'm pinning them on, just as a double check to make sure they're all exactly the same spot on the side seams. Again, right sides together. My pocket pieces do not have a right and wrong side. Your right side of your pocket is actually going to be where your hand is touching when you put your pocket in. So the right side, you're doing right sides together, that will be what you will see if you kind of open the pocket and peek into it. That is what we are calling the right side. And now we're going to stitch our pocket pieces to all of our side seams using a 3/8 seam allowance, which is smaller than most of our other seams here. I did forget to mention, I like to serge the ends of my pocket before I even stitch it or pin it anywhere. You can wait until after, but I like this method. This is what I prefer. After we've stitched, I like to serge or finish the edge down this side seam completely, and then I like to press this seam and press my pocket away from the main short piece. We're going to repeat that on all 4 pieces, both fronts, both backs. Now this step is optional, but I do recommend it for the inseam pockets. I like to top stitch right here, and you're going to top stitch your seam allowance to the pocket. This just helps your pocket piece not kind of want to stick out of the pocket hole. Makes it kind of lay a little bit flatter and nicer, and kind of keep that pocket lining fabric from being seen too much. Especially if you're using pocket fabric like mine, that is a true lining fabric. It's not the same. You're not just using the same fabric. It's going to stick out a lot if the pocket fabric is seen. Now we're going to put right sides together, one front and one back, and we're going to pin at the side seams. Always pin at the top and bottom, and then pin in between. We're going to sew from the top down to the pocket, around the pocket, then down the rest of the side seam. If you're doing a short inseam like I am, it's not that much room along the top or the bottom. The pocket takes up quite a bit of the short if you're doing the shorter inseam. Now all of our edges should be finished off if you did it like me. So we're just going to stitch with our sewing machine and then we'll be done. We're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. So you will not be stitching on top of your previous stitches where you stitched your pocket to the side seam. It should be a deeper seam allowance. What this does is when you turn them right sides out, your pocket pieces are going to be 1/8 of an inch inside your normal seam allowance, and that will help tuck those pocket pieces in and not see the fabric. I'll kind of make sure it's hidden. My bobbin thread ran out here. If, like me, you've already serged all of your edges, you can take your seam allowance down smaller around the pocket, 1/4 of an inch, just outside your serge seam if you want that little bit extra room in your pocket. Again, if you're using fabric like linen or flannel that tend to fray, I would go ahead and still use the larger seam allowance that will help it prevent from fraying. Again, on this side, you're going to go past your stitch line where you stitched at 3/8 of an inch all the way to a full 1/2 inch, which is just 1/8 of an inch more. And take it to your iron, give it a nice press, open it up, and give it another press just like this. And when you press this pocket, you'll see that it's going to fold under that 1/8 of an inch. And it's going to overlap the other pocket 1/8 of an inch. It just helps hide your pocket fabric. As you can see, it does not poke out when it is just turned right sides up. So after you give it a nice press, you can top stitch here or you can add bar tacks here. I do like to add the bar tacks just because if you are using the pockets a lot, you're putting your hands in and out, maybe putting phone and whatever else inside your pockets all the time, it is a high stress area and a bar tack is so quick and easy. My machine has a bar tack stitch. This is what it looks like. You can also make it a little shorter if you want it a little shorter. If your machine does not have a bar tack specific stitch, it's just a zigzag stitch where you reinforce that little area and it looks like a little bar. You want the stitch length to be pretty short, and it can be as wide as you want. You can see sorry, I hit my phone again. It's so hard not to hit the phone when it's right next to me as I'm sewing. But here's a traditional bar tack. It's pretty narrow and it can be as long as you want. I like it to be the same length about as my seam allowance on this area. You can see it's just a little narrow zigzag and it just helps reinforce that so that when you're using the pockets and putting your hands in and out, that high stress area that's holding the top and bottom edges of the pocket aren't gonna come unstitched. And here's our finished pocket. You're gonna repeat on your other side. Whether you started with the left leg or the right leg, you're just going to repeat on your other back and front pieces. And then you can sew up the inseams. You're just going to fold your right or left leg, whichever one you started with, and match up your inseams, stitch, and then also finish off that seam allowance however you like, whether you have a serger or you just use overcast stitch, zigzag, however you like to finish your seam allowances. You can finish each piece separately and then stitch them together, or finish them together after, whichever you prefer. Once you're done, give it a press. You can top stitch the seam if you prefer. Once you have sewn this on both sides, left leg, right leg, then we're going to get ready to do the crotch seam. If you're doing a boxer fly, you're going to be doing this a little bit different. I do have a different video only doing the boxer fly, so if you need some more help with that, you can go ahead and click that one. You're going to turn one leg right sides out, one leg wrong sides out. Your right sides out, you're going to slip into your wrong sides out so that they are right sides together, and you're going to pin all along the crotch curve. So you're going to start at the front center, go down to the inseam, and then to the back center. And it kind of makes like a U shape. You can picture the shorts on, you know, from your front center down through your legs up through the back center. It's a U shape. Now, as you can see in this video, I'm going to completely forget about that closed faux fly, and I'm just going to be sewing this crotch seam like I am not doing the faux fly. See, there's that nice U shape. We're going to stitch it together. So if you're doing no fly, this is exactly what you want to do, just like this. Now, if you're doing the faux fly, wait just a minute and I will realize, oops, I wanted to do the closed fly, and I will go back and add it. It takes me a while. It takes all the way to the top stitching, which I wish it didn't, but it did take that long before I realized that I forgot that little fly piece. Luckily, there's no picking seams. I didn't have to pick any seams for this mistake, so, you know, on the scale of mistakes, it wasn't too bad. I am sorry if it confuses you, if you're doing the closed fly and you're gonna have to wait for me to realize I forgot it. If you're doing the regular fly, you're gonna go ahead and finish that seam allowance, and then you can press this and you can top stitch all along this seam. If you are wanting to sew it in the traditional way, usually if it's for a feminine wear, you press the seam to the left. I'm sewing for my baby girl, and that's what I'm going to do, because why not follow tradition? I don't know. But either way, you press it to the left or the right, and then just top stitch it along. I'm going to do 2 rows of stitching. I am going to realize that I forgot the fly right here, because as I'm top stitching, I'm going to realize, in fact, I have not top stitched a fly, and I wanted that fly. So that's what made me finally realize it. This is a nice seam to top stitch. Oh, there it is. That's the moment where I realized I forgot the fly. So I'm gonna stop top stitching here. I stop at the inseam because it just seemed like a nice stopping point. The crotch seam is a really nice seam not to skip top stitching on, because it does get a lot of stress. Okay, so now I'm going back. I remember the fly. I do recommend serging the curved edge if you're using a woven fabric that's going to fray. Okay, so rewind. When we were doing the crotch seam, we should have put this here, okay? On the wearer's left side, if you want to follow tradition and you're sewing for a feminine model. Masculine is usually on the right side, I believe. I'm not sure, I always sew feminine, so and we're going to press the seam all the way to the left. That does get a bulky seam there, but that's okay. That's what's going to make it look like it's a real fly, is that added bulk. So don't worry about it being bulky. Give it a nice press to the left, and then I'll show you how I like to do all of my top stitching. I like to kind of mimic traditional jean denim top stitching. You do not have to if you don't want to. You can look at some jeans that you have and like the top stitching and mimic it, or do your own thing. Be creative. I'm going to show you here what I like to do most of the time. So I'm top stitching close to the seam allowance. It's probably about a 1/16 of an inch away from that seam allowance, all up the front. Then I like to go across the top. This just based that faux fly down along the top. That'll be nice for when we're attaching the waistband. Now I top stitch from the top of the fabric. You can certainly stitch from the underside so that you can see that little faux fly piece better. I just feel it, especially because it has that serged edge. It's quite easy to feel where it is. You can see it, my fingers just kind of feeling for that edge. And I stitch about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, so I kind of follow the inside of the serged edge. Once I'm back to my original top stitch, I go up just a few stitches, and then I go back around, and I just use the edge of my foot against the previously sewn stitch line. I do also include a piece that you can print on cardstock or even just paper, and you can use it to kind of chalk mark where your top stitching should be if you want to stitch from the top side, but you're having a hard time just feeling through your fabric. I like to add a little bar tack right here. Again, this is absolutely not functioning. It's not a real fly. It's not a high stress area. I'm just mimicking what traditional denim with a real zip fly would need. And then I like to add another one here. Again, you don't need it. You can skip it if you want to. And I don't always do all the bar tacks. Since these are denim, I thought it would be a cute add-on, and it only takes a few seconds for those little details. And it makes it look a little bit more like a real functioning fly to have all of the stitching. Now from that bark tack, I go down, and I'm going to again use the edge of my foot from the previous stitch line all the way through to the back center so that I have a double line of top stitching all along the back seam. Again, the crotch seam does get a lot of stress when wearing. These are pretty loose, but it's still just an area that gets a lot of stress from sitting, squatting, moving around, your thighs touching together. And so it is nice to take the time to top stitch your crotch seam just to help it hold up with wear and tear. All right, here's the back, and here's what it looks like on the front, and a little glance at what it looks like on the inside. Again, you can sew it from this side as well if you want to see that piece to follow it a little bit easier, or you can use the piece to lay on top and mark it with a marking tool. Next up is our waistband. I have pressed mine in half, and I have pressed some interfacing on the center. I'm going to add a few buttonholes really quickly. I am not going to go into detail about adding the buttonholes. We do have a blog post with a ton of tips and tricks on adding buttonholes if you're having a hard time getting your machine to do nice buttonholes. The biggest thing is adding that interfacing. If you have interfacing, your machine should do pretty well with it. I like to use a really small little tiny button for these buttonholes so they're not too big once I top stitch my waistband, but big enough that I can fit my drawstring through easily. Alright, now that we're done with that, we can fold it in half horizontally and stitch it into a circle. If you are doing the adult, you're going to have 2 waistband pieces and you're going to stitch them at both side seams to create a circle. A lot of the adult sizes don't fit on a width of fabric, especially if you're using that more narrow cotton fabric, like a quilting cotton. So that's why it is in 2 pieces instead of 1 like the youth. Press your seam open and then press in half vertically, which I have obviously already done. Now we're going to find our even quarter points. This is very easy on the adult since it has 2 side seams. You just need to find the center front, center back. On the youth, you have center front, center back, and your 2 side seams. I use the seam in the back as my center back area, and then I have the front marked since I did a drawstring option. On some of the youth, the side seams are your quarter points. On a lot of the adults, they are not, because we are curvier than the youth and our backs are usually much more curvy than the front. So the back is wider than the front. So make sure you actually find the quarter points and don't just assume that the side seams are your quarter points, because on the adult sizes they often are not. Now we're just aligning those quarter points and pinning or clipping our waistband right sides together to the top of our shorts. If you did inseam pockets like me, you want those seam allowances to go toward the front with the pockets. This should be nice and easy step. You shouldn't need to ease anything in. It should be exactly the same circumference. Your waistband should be the same circumference as the top of your shorts, as long as you cut really precisely and stuck with all your seam allowances really precisely, and your fabric didn't grow or stretch or anything. If you're finding it difficult, you might want to go back and double check those seam allowances. Make sure you sew them at 1/2 inch. Make sure your circumferences are coming out the same. All right, we're going to stitch this together, except for we're going to leave 1 to 2 inches unsewn. We're going to use that little unsewn area to guide our elastic in like a casing. So 1/2 inch seam allowance here, straight stitch, nice and easy peasy. I'm going to speed it up just a little bit because it is a really easy step and I just don't have very many tips or tricks to give here. Again, we're going to stop our stitching an inch or 2 away from completing the whole circle around the whole waistband. We're going to use that little gap, our favorite feeding tool or safety pin, to guide our elastic in. The elastic measurement I give is for knit elastic. It's what I prefer. They do tend to twist and turn and fold even sometimes when you're using heavier fabric, which is why I suggest stitching your elastic down in your waistband. And you might say, well, why don't you just use non-roll elastic? You can. You might want to double check it doesn't feel too tight if you don't plan on stitching it down and you plan on using non-roll, because I feel like it feels much tighter than knit elastic. The reason why I still use knit elastic, even though it tends to roll or fold up or move around in there, is because I think it's softer and more comfortable. I also like the look of a stitched waistband, so I don't mind needing to stitch the waistband down every time because I like the way that looks anyways. If you don't like to stitch the waistband down and you don't want your waistband flipping and turning and moving around too much, I would use non-roll elastic. I would just test it out before cutting it because you might want to add an inch or two to the measurement depending on your size and how tight you like the elastic. I usually like to add a little bit of length when I'm using non-roll elastic. The elastic measurement I give is for a knit elastic. Also, if you're not stitching it down, you might want to add an inch anyways, because when you do stitch the elastic down in the waistband, no matter how good your elastic is, and if you exercise it first, it is going to lose some length. It is going to loosen up. So just a few tips and tricks on the elastic there. I am stitching my two ends of the elastics together now that I've fed it through. Just use a really wide zigzag with a short stitch length. Again, I'm going to stitch mine all across the waistband, so it doesn't have to be a super intense stitch here. It's not going to get a lot of pulling since it's going to be stitched all the way around the waistband. If you are not stitching your waistband, you do want to make sure it's nice and secure so it doesn't pop open. Finish stitching that waistband, that 1 to 2 inches that we left open, we're just going to close it up. Now you can finish off this seam allowance either with your serger or however you finish off your seams. Then you can tug your waistband and elastic to kind of get those gathers even around your waistband. And then I do recommend giving it a press and pressing your seam allowance down and your waistband up. Another little trick, if you're shaped like me or my daughter where all of your measurement, all your hip measurement is in the back, you can slide a little extra fabric to the back before stitching your waistband down. I find this fits me and my daughter much better. We're kind of S-shaped where we're not very curvy from the front and back, but if we turn to the side, that's where all of our hip measurement is, kind of straight back in the booty. And so the extra gathering in the booty really helps. You can also do this the opposite. If you have a bigger belly than a booty and your hip measurement is more in your belly than your booty, you can slide a little bit of more fabric towards the front where you need it. I'm top stitching I think the same as the suggested ones on the pattern piece. I like to stitch pretty close to the top and the bottom. I just like the way that looks, especially because it usually gives me room for my buttonholes or grommets in the middle. I think I'm 1/4 of an inch away from the top. It might be in between 1/4 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch here. I can't really remember. You know, I just kind of do it however I like the look of. You can stitch as many lines or as few lines as you want. If you don't want to stitch all along your waistband like this, you can just tack it down in a few places, maybe at the side seam, center front, center back, and that will also help your gathers kind of stay where you want them and keep your elastic from rolling or folding or getting twisted up or anything like that. If you do like stitching all along your waistband, you're just going to stretch both behind the foot and in front of the foot until your fabric doesn't have gathers. That's as far as this is going to stretch anyways. Your elastic can probably stretch much more, but there's no need to stretch anymore because your fabric isn't stretching any wider than that anyways. So you're going to grab the back, grab the front, stretch until there's no gathers, and then stitch all along it. I remember when I was a beginner, I kind of felt like I needed an extra arm. But if you press your seam allowance and your fabric down really well before this, it really isn't too difficult. Another thing that you can do, which some of my patterns do this, is you can and put your elastic in your waistband and stitch on it before you attach the waistband to the shorts. So you can do that method too. I like both. I like to put different methods and different patterns just so everyone can try them all out and see what their favorite is. So if you prefer to do the waistband stitching before you attach it, you can do that too. Just remember to leave that 1/2 inch seam allowance to attach to your shorts. It is important after you're all done doing your waistband stitching to give it a really nice good press, because again, your elastic is going to stretch out while you're stitching it down through your waistband multiple times. That will help bring your elastic back to life. It'll also help set the gathers, both along your waistband and along your shorts. So if you don't press it really well, it might look really poofy, and you might not like that. Even without top stitching your seam allowance, giving it a really nice press is going to help make it not so poofy. If you can see the difference before and after. I certainly can, and I highly recommend giving it a really nice press. If you want to top stitch along that seam allowance, you certainly can too. If your fabric is very poofy, you might want to. It'll help that a little bit. Now we're going to do the drawstring. This is done like binding, so we're going to press the top edges down about 1/4 inch, press it in half, then press the top raw edge and the bottom raw edge to the center crease, fold it along the crease one more time, and voila, all of our raw edges should be all hidden. You can also sew this as a tube. Personally, I just don't like turning the teeny tiny tubes, especially in a fabric like denim. It can get pretty terrible to turn a super teeny tiny tube. So I like sewing it like binding like this, but you can sew it in a tube. You can also just use pre-made drawstring. You can use twill tape. You can use a shoelace, whatever you like. But if you want your drawstring to match, I added in the directions this time. My testers thought it would be nice to have it in the tutorial, so here you are. If you don't and you want to do your own thing, go ahead, just ignore it. That's what I usually do. If you are doing your own thing on the drawstring, one thing I recommend is going off the hip measurement instead of the waist measurement. That way when you're pulling it on and off, you have plenty of ease to get on your hip plus some extra so that your drawstring doesn't get sucked up into your waistband. Especially if you have a smaller waist to hip. If I went off my waist, then when I pulled it over my much larger hip, they would disappear into that waistband, never to be seen again. So always go off your hip measurement. I'm saying you can go down a second row of stitching if you like double stitching. I did not on this one. I just closed it up and then moved on with my life. There's our drawstring. And then you can just use a safety pin or whatever your favorite feeding tool is to feed it through your drawstring hole around the back and out the other one. And once you're done feeding your drawstring all the way through and kind of getting it a little even on both sides. I always like to tack it down. I usually tack it in the center back, and that just keeps mostly little ones from pulling the drawstring all the way out, or even just pulling it so far on one side that the opposite side disappears into the waistband, which is always a pain, right? So I like to, if it's a youth and there is a seam in the center back of the waistband, I like to just stitch in the ditch right there. If it's the adult, I still stitch it in the center back even though there's no seam. It's just something that I like to do. Sometimes they can even come out like in the washer, dryer. So I just always like to tack it down just in case. We're going to move on to the leg cuffs now. I have pre-pressed mine. So I'm going to unfold them here, fold them in half horizontally, and we're going to stitch into a circle with our regular 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you are doing the contrast little piece on the cuffs, you're just going to repeat the same step for your contrast piece. It's just going to be smaller. And you will have 2 of your regular cuffs and 2 of the little contrast pieced cuffs. Once we're done stitching them into circles, you can press the seam open. And then if you haven't pre-pressed like me, I'm going to press them in half vertically. And then we're going to mark both the cuff and the bottom thigh, the bottom hem of the legs, into even halfway points. So I'm going to use the seam as one marking point and then the opposite point of that. And on the legs, I'm going to use the inseam as my one point, and then line up the edges along the bottom to find the opposite point. It is not at the side seam. The back is wider than the front because we are wider on the back than the front. So I'm going to match up those 2 opposite points, and then I'm going to use the seam on the cuff, and I'm going to align that to the inseam of the shorts. Your cuff should be right sides together to your shorts, and you're just aligning all the raw edges here. In between your 2 halfway marks, you're just going to pin or clip. You should not need to ease anything in. The circumference of your cuffs should be exactly the same as the circumference of your legs. If they're coming out wildly different, go back and double check all of your seam allowances. If you cut your pieces accurately and sewed your seam allowances accurately, the circumference should be the same. You shouldn't need to ease anything in much at all here. We're just going to stitch these together using the normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. I am going to speed it up just because it's a really simple step here. Don't ever want to bore anybody. Finish the edges here, and then we're going to flip the cuff down. And you can either press the seam allowance up or down, whatever you prefer the look of. If you press it up, kind of looks more like a hem. If you press it down, it looks more like a added cuff. So whatever you like the look of. If you have the contrast piece, you could also flip that little contrast cuff piece up or down, depending on what you like the look of. I do recommend top stitching this after you're giving it a good press. Whichever way you decide to flip the seam allowance or contrast trim piece, press it whichever way you like, and then go in for a top stitch. Again, I'm going to speed this up because it's just a really simple top stitch step. You can do whatever seam allowance you want here from the seam, 1 rows, 2 rows, whatever you like the look of. There you go, our cuff piece is all done. And then you just need to repeat on the other leg. Once you're all done with the other leg, you're all finished. You can give your shorts one last press all the way around. Then you're ready to wear them. These Junebug boxer shorts are named after my little niece. Her nickname's Junebug. She really was into the boxer look, and she loves them, and I hope you love them too. Don't forget to share them with us.